And next, a billionaire investor attacking the Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen for not taking advantage of low interest rates.
It was the biggest blunder in the history of the Treasury.
Secretary Yellen responds exclusively next. The breaking news, the GOP-led House just passing a $14.3 billion aid to Israel bill, a bill that has no funding for the Ukraine war against Russia, and a bill that has $14.3 billion in IRS cuts. Cuts that new Speaker Mike Johnson says offset the aid. 12 Democrats joined most Republicans to pass it. The bill, of course, may go nowhere in the Senate, where Democrats and even some top Republicans want Ukraine aid included. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen spoke with us earlier, and I began by asking her whether the House bill is a non-starter.
Absolutely. I think it's an irresponsible bill, tying support for Israel, lacking support for Ukraine, which are both vital national security interests, and then tying aid for Israel to what is really an irresponsible proposal to cut funding for our Internal Revenue Service. The only gainers from that are wealthy tax cheats and corporations that will pay fewer taxes that they owe because the IRS will be deprived of $14 billion of money for tax enforcement. The Congressional Budget Office estimated that loss of $14 billion would result in almost twice that, around $27 billion of reduced tax revenues. So overall, cutting funding for the Internal Revenue Service doesn't cut the deficit, it raises it substantially.
Secretary, if you're forced, though, into a situation, just through the political process, where it's, say, getting aid to Israel in addition to some IRS cuts or other things you don't like, or no aid for Israel at all, which would you choose?
Well, the president has made clear that he would veto the bill in the House that ties aid for Israel to cuts in funding for the Internal Revenue Service. The Ukraine situation and Israel both have strong bipartisan backing, and it's critical that we quickly provide both those forms of aid. With respect to Ukraine, we have a country that is fighting hard to preserve its democracy after a brutal attack by Russia. This is not something that is our funding only good for Ukraine. It's in our own national security interest, because if we don't stand up when Russia attacks Ukraine, we don't know what countries might be next.
Secretary Yellen, we live in uncertain times and very frightening times, and these wars are obviously both part of that. I mean, in the Israeli war against Hamas, I know this matters to you as an American, but also on a personal level. You've talked about your father's family coming to the U.S. from a small town in Poland, and you've talked about how much of that town was destroyed in the Holocaust. Nearly the entire Jewish population was deported or murdered. And Secretary, I know that included your own family. And now we're seeing a disturbing rise in anti-Semitism around the world and in the United States, a 400% rise in anti-Semitic incidents reported by the Anti-Defamation League. And that's just since the terror attacks on October 7th. I mean, Secretary, are you taken aback by this? How troubled are you by this?
I'm very troubled by this. I was appalled by the brutal attacks by Hamas on Israel, and feel that Israel deserves our unqualified support. But it's critically important also to attempt to minimize casualties of civilians in Gaza, and I'm very supportive of efforts to, as President Biden is, to bring humanitarian relief to Gazans so that we don't see needless tragedy there as well.
Secretary, I do want to ask you also about some other comments, which you may well have seen just the other day from the billionaire investor Stanley Druckenmiller. He was speaking on a panel and he was talking about what he sees as the Treasury Department's failure to lock in low interest rates. And he was saying virtually all Americans went and refinanced, locking in low mortgage rates. Companies went out and borrowed money to take advantage of the incredibly low interest rates. He says everybody did it except for the Treasury Department. He puts this on you personally. Here's what he said.
Janet Yellen, I guess because political myopia, whatever, was issuing 2 years at 15 basis points when she could have issued 10 years at 70 basis points or 30 years at 180 basis points. I literally think if you go back to Alexander Hamilton, it was the biggest blunder in the history of the Treasury, and I have no idea why she has not been called out on this. She has no right to still be in that job.
Well, Secretary, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to what Stanley Druckenmiller said.
Well, I disagree with that assessment. We have been lengthening the average maturity of the portfolio, and in fact, at present, the duration of the portfolio is about the longest it has been in decades. We have found in regular discussions with Wall Street professionals having regular and predictable issuance of maturities across the spectrum, both long, intermediate, and short, is critical to having deep and liquid markets for U.S. Treasuries, which is critical to lowering our costs over time. And that is exactly what we've been doing.
All right. And that's your response tonight. And Secretary Yellen, we very much appreciate your time tonight, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.